out-of-body experience, physical matter reality, non-physical matter reality, absolute unbounded oneness, and absolute unbounded manifold. We're going to learn tonight in the next hour with my guest, Tom Campbell, what exactly those terms mean. Tom Campbell is author of My Big Toe trilogy, written in the language of contemporary Western culture, which unifies science and philosophy, physics and metaphysics, mind and matter, purpose and meaning, the normal and the paranormal. The entirety of human experience, the mind, body, and spirit, including both our objective and subjective worlds, are brought together under one seamless scientific understanding. Tom Campbell began researching altered states of consciousness with Bob Monroe at Monroe Laboratories in the early 1970s, where he and a few others were instrumental in getting Monroe's laboratory for the study of consciousness up and running. These early drug-free consciousness pioneers helped design experiments, developed the technology for creating specific altered states, and were the main subjects of study, or guinea pigs, all at the same time. Tom has been experimenting with and exploring the subjective and objective mind ever since. For the past 30 years, Tom has been focusing on scientifically exploring the properties, boundaries, and abilities of consciousness, one of my favorite topics. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Hillary.
It's a pleasure to have you on the air tonight, and I have to also mention to everybody listening that Tom was also a fellow cast member in the documentary that we did together called The Path Afterlife, which you can find a lot of information on my website for those of you who aren't familiar yet with it. So, Tom, where do you want to start? This wonderful book, the trilogies are just incredible. The information that you have are wonderful. How did you get into studying consciousness as a scientist?
Well, that was really got into studying it seriously as a scientist when I met Bob Monroe. Before then, I had done some transcendental meditation, so I was familiar with my own consciousness and with the idea that altered states of consciousness had certain value. I found I could debug computer code, for instance, while in a meditative state, much better than I could if I was actually looking at the code. So I was familiar with the larger reality system as consciousness, I guess, in a vague way. But when I ran into Bob Monroe in the early 70s, I think it was like 1972, that started off an adventure that hasn't ended yet. And Bob was looking for some scientists to help him put together a lab. He had a shell of a building at the time, didn't have any equipment in it, didn't really know what he was going to do with it. He just knew that he wanted to study consciousness, he wanted to study out of body, and he wanted to make it scientific. He didn't want to be the weird old guy that had funny things happen to him. He wanted this to be, on the scientific map as a legitimate experience. So he was putting this lab together. He was a fairly wealthy gentleman, and he was looking for some people, and I just happened to cross his path about that time. So that's how I got started with Bob. And once you start down this path, it's not a path that you easily just walk away from and say, that was fun, now let's go do something else. Once you get started on this path, one thing leads to the next, and it becomes a passion for a lifetime.
Well, hopefully in this hour we'll talk about your own personal journey because I'm sure it's obviously been very much affected by your research. And as you're talking about the science laboratory, what comes to mind is the popular TV show called Fringe. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I'm a big fan. So I always it's funny how the scientific and consciousness stuff comes together. So how for those listening, what would you describe? What's the definition in your for an out of body experience? How do you define that?
Well, that's a little bit problematical. Bob made up that word, out of body, OOBE. Before then, it was astral projection. It went by a few other names as well. And he wanted to get rid of all of that previous baggage because there was a lot of belief systems that were around those words and what they meant. So he wanted to start fresh with a new idea that didn't come encumbered with a lot of belief systems. So he coined this word out-of-body experience and used an acronym. Bob was very fond of acronyms, so he called it an OOBE. And the unfortunate thing about that word is that the B is for body, and it's not about the body. You are consciousness. That's what you are. Your consciousness is already out of your body. You don't need to get out of your body. You just need to get into your consciousness. So it's a little different perspective. But so Bob publishes books, and 20 other people have published books about their adventures in the larger reality. And the problem with that is that other people then read those books and try to duplicate that experience. They think that's it, and that's not true. It's a matter of you becoming aware and operative in consciousness. And what you are going to experience there has a lot to do with you. It's not the same as walking outside and going to the park and counting the number of benches and how many trees are in the park, and everybody counts the same number and so on, because in consciousness space, you receiving data. Okay, you don't really have eyes. Eyes are physical, but that doesn't mean you don't see, but you see with the word see in quotes. In other words, you get data, you interpret that data, and then you take that interpretation and interpret it once again into things that are described by your senses, like seeing and hearing and touching. Because if we're going to communicate those experiences, we have to put them into language, and language only talks in terms of physical reality. So we have to express ourselves in terms of what did it look like, what did it sound like, what did it feel like, because that's the only way we have to express ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So, and how do symbols fit into that?
Symbols?
Working with symbols, yeah.
Yeah, what we get when we get this data is we translate it into symbols and the metaphors. And there's a very close association actually between symbols and metaphors as well. A metaphor is probably you might say a wordy symbol. It's something that kind of a simple thing that stands for something else. That's the way metaphors work. So symbols are the same way. It's something that stands for something else. So symbols and metaphors are the kind of the currency of consciousness for us who are embodied here in this physical reality frame, because we have to translate the data we get into a way of communicating and thinking about it in this reality frame, and that means it comes back in terms of symbols and metaphors.
Mm. So would you describe it then as the language of consciousness?
Symbols and metaphors?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably a good way to say it, but it's not just the language of consciousness. It's the language that we, who are embodied here in this physical matter reality, have to speak when we interact, when we communicate with consciousness. So it's what we're forced into doing, because we have to bring it back into our own reality frame, and that depends on our experience. If you have no experience whatsoever and you run into some of this data, you will interpret it rather wildly. There'll be great big three-headed monsters chasing you and other such things. You get a very wild interpretation. If you have more experience, you're able to interpret it differently. So the things that people come back and say they saw and smelled and heard are their interpretations, their metaphors. That seeing, hearing, and smelling is their own metaphor for the experience that they had. Now, the experience is a real experience. The data is objective. But what they make of it and how they interpret it depends on a lot of things. Depends on their own experience base, depends on their beliefs, depends on, their approach to reality. So all those things will make a difference, where one person will come back and say, I met a great sage who was, teaching other people. Another will come back and say that it was an angel, or it was, they'll put it in the form of a religious figure, because that's the way they interpret that sort of thing. So we don't need to look at
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So we don't need to really look at the words so much as we need to read between the lines. The things that people experience in out of body, if you read between the lines and don't really worry too much about the metaphors and symbols that they're using, you'll see a consistency often, and you'll see that that consistency runs, for millennia. So there is a real thing there. It's just that you cannot experience that thing the way we experience a physical reality. You only think you are because that's the way you interpret it.
So would you then go into describing what you mean by physical matter reality? Are you basically saying that the reality you think you are in the now is different for every single person?
Well, yes, it is. This reality frame, and I call it the physical frame, and in my books that's called physical matter reality, and the reason you put the matter there, you could just say physical reality, but then there's another frame, which is everything else, and we call that non-physical matter reality, and the reason we put the matter there is that both of them have matter, if you will. Both of them are as real as each other. In other words, there is no fundamental reality frame. The dream reality, for instance, is just as real and just as significant as this reality we call physical. And when we're in that dream reality, things seem physical to us there. Now, we have a different rule set, a different physics. We can fly in that dream reality and do other kinds of strange things, but that's just a different rule set that it's based on. It feels physical there, and when we're there in that dream reality, this reality does not seem physical. It's kind of like the dream was. It's just in our mind. When we're in this reality, then this reality seems physical. So whatever reality you have your awareness in, that seems physical. Whatever reality you don't have your awareness in seems non-physical. So there is really no such thing as physical and non-physical. You could say everything
when you
is
consciousness,
or nothing.
I think we're breaking up a little bit. I'm sorry, Tom, you still there?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, okay. Your voice sounds fine.
You were breaking up on this end. So I have a question. The consciousness, how do you heal with consciousness? There's a lot of talk out in the world right now about elevating your consciousness, raising to higher consciousness. How do you interpret what that means scientifically with your mindset and frame of reference?
Well, first you understand that everything is consciousness. The only thing that's fundamental is consciousness. Everything else is virtual. So this physical matter reality we're in is virtual, and the dream reality is virtual, and the reality that Uncle Fred goes to when he dies, that's virtual. All of these reality frames are just virtual realities. They are data received by consciousness. So first you get the concept that consciousness is the fundamental reality. So then how does one individual person, and I call that a individuated unit of consciousness, how does a person raise the quality of their consciousness, grow spiritually, whatever? And you do that by, you ask for a scientific definition, you do that by lowering the entropy of your consciousness, which means that you reorganize the bits in your consciousness such that they are more profitable, such that there's more organization, which gives you more ability to do things. Now, that's called evolution. Consciousness is a system that is evolving. So we are evolving. We're part of that evolution. As we evolve our consciousness, the whole consciousness system evolves. We're all one with this thing. It's like we're subsets of a larger thing. And all consciousness is netted. And you go about this through intent, your intent to grow. You have to want to see a bigger picture. You have to desire to do it. You have to intend to let go of ego, to let go of fear, to be love. All of these things are attributes of a low entropy consciousness. And as you do these things, then you have the awareness, of a higher quality consciousness. Some of the paranormal things are just there for you to do if you want to do them, but none of these paranormal things are must-dos. None of them do you have to do for any reason whatsoever. They're just available. So you raise the level of your consciousness through your own hard work, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, as I say in the books, and growing up, letting go of fear, letting go of ego. So that's how one does it. So that brings us back to things that you hear now a lot in the literature about, one day, maybe 2012, we'll all just take a great, leap forward in consciousness. In my book, that is not likely to happen. And the reason that's not likely to happen is there is no free lunch. It's not a matter of being at the right place at the right time. So you get a free pass and get to, jump up a level that you haven't earned. Consciousness is about evolution. Evolution doesn't skip steps like that. You have to evolve your consciousness through your own effort and your own work. And it would surprise me very much if there was a free pass for everybody to take a giant step. That just isn't the way the system works. But now, having said that, I'll also tell you that I'm one that will never say never. Almost anything can happen. I've been knocking around in the larger reality long enough to know that you get in deep trouble when you start using words like always and never.
So this pretty much leads right into what a non-physical matter reality is then, because you've described for us what the physical matter reality, and as you were talking about the dream state, you touched a little bit on the non-physical. What is the difference between what is non-physical matter reality? Let's start there.
The way we define that is that you have this, what we call physical. Like I say, it's just physical because this is where our awareness is. It's no different than a non-physical reality other than our awareness is here instead of there. So I define, this physical matter reality is the reality that you and I and the other, 6 billion of us here on this planet see as our reality frame, good old physical matter reality. And everything else then, if it's not in this universe, physical matter reality is our entire universe. If it's not a part of this universe, then it's non-physical. Now, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. It's the frame in which we are aware, or it's non-physical. Now, when you get out of this physical frame that we're in and into other frames, you find that there's lots of other non-physical frames. So just lumping them all together kind of makes it easy. It's here and not here sort of thing. So that's what I call the non-physical. But there are literally hundreds of different reality frames in the non-physical.
And is this a difficult concept for people to understand?
Well, it depends. If you've never had any experience in other reality frames, and I would say dreaming is one of those other reality frames, but if you've never had a cognitive experience where you were in charge, I guess what they would call lucid dreaming, or out-of-body experience, or other just exploring the larger reality, if none of that is in your experience, then this is a little hard for some people to get a handle on, and that's because we talk about this physical reality being a virtual reality. That's a very difficult concept for a lot of people to understand. That it is just virtual. It's just data. It doesn't exist the way you think it does. It's just data in your mind, and we are consciousness. And the physical reality is a subset, is a derivative of consciousness. So consciousness is the superset, and the reality frames are the subsets.
So would you describe the human body then as like a biological computer, and these things that you're describing as kind of software programs for each individual?
Well, that might be one way of looking at it. But here's kind of the way to think of this. If you look at your reality frame, the data you have, wherever you are now listening to this, whatever you're hearing, whatever you're seeing, what is that? It's just data, okay? And it's not only just data, it's digital data. And by digital, I mean it comes in discrete bits. So what you're seeing is coming in discrete bits called photons, and they come and they hit your eyeball. You get focused on the retina. The retina then creates electrical signals. Electrical signals stimulate neurons, and that's what you're seeing is. It's digital data. First it's photons, then it's electrical signals, and then it's neurons, and that is digital information. That's all it is. And what you're hearing is the same way. It all turns into electrical signals and neurons. So all of what you see is reality. Everything that comes through your senses just gets turned into digital data. That's all it is. And then we interpret that digital data as whatever it is we're seeing. You know, the wall, the flower, the house, the car, all the things we're looking at and the things we're listening to. That's how we interpret that digital data. So our reality already, in those terms, when you look at physically what's going on, our reality is generated by digital data. Okay, now let's take one step further and say that there's this magic machine that can stimulate our nervous system in exactly the same way that it's being stimulated now as we're seeing and hearing whatever we're seeing and hearing. If that was the case, what would you experience? Well, you'd experience exactly what you're experiencing now. So if you were put in some kind of a sensory deprivation chamber, locked in the bottom of a deep, dark pit, where there was nothing that you could feel or hear or see, and then you had this machine stimulate your nerves just the way they're being stimulated now, you'd see and hear exactly what you're seeing and hearing now, and there would be no way for you to tell the difference. So your reality is just data that you're receiving and you're interpreting, and the fact is that what you're getting is a data stream to your consciousness, and your consciousness is interpreting this physical reality. So what is the body? The body is an interpretation of the data you receive, but it also has to abide by a rule set. Okay, the rule set is how this physical reality works. Any reality frame, any virtual reality needs a rule set to define it. Otherwise everything is random, everything is haphazard. So our rule set here is physics, and physics defines our reality. Things evolve. Our bodies have evolved to be how they are according to the rule set, and that determines the data that we get and how we interpret it. So is this beginning to make a little sense, or am I just confusing you more?
No, it's great. I'm curious too, because you talk about how chakras are metaphors and not fundamental, and I'm curious what that means.
Okay, well, what that means is the same thing we were talking about before. What you see, you turn into symbols and metaphors. Now, that means there's just consciousness, and consciousness communicates with consciousness by exchanging data. So when I heal somebody, if I'm working in healing, I use a beam of light, right? And I look at the place that's diseased, and I visualize that as a dark spot, and then I put these real bright lights on it, and I turn it white and so on. Well, all of that are just metaphors. There is no such thing as light. There is no such thing as an energy body. There are no such things as chakras. There's no such things as any of those things. That's just our interpretation. Okay, now, of course, I see auras, have for, 45 years, but that's my interpretation. You go into the database, all of the data from this conscious machine, if it's just data being passed around, but there's also, records are kept of all the data and what's going on. Obviously, you couldn't run a reality if you didn't keep track of what it was you were doing. And you go into the database, and you tell the database how you would like to see the output. So you'd say, I would like to see such and such's health body. And I would like to see all the tissue that's healthy is bright white, and all the tissue that's diseased and unhealthy is dark. And the darker, it is, the more serious the disease. So basically, I'm taking a query into the database, and I'm giving it an output format, and that's all I need to get the data. So here I see this picture of this humanoid body, and I see parts of it, most of it is light, and it's got dark spots in it. And then I want to heal it. So I have to affect that some way, because that's the way I believe, because I'm a human here in this physical matter reality. I think I can't do anything if I can't, I can't affect anything if I don't do something. So I get my zapper or my laser beam or my energy bar tool or whatever you want to call it, and I can turn those spots white, those black spots white, but all of that are just metaphors helping me focus my intent. It's the consciousness intent is the active ingredient. That's what's actually doing something. All the rest of it are just tools. So the symbols are tools. You're a Reiki master, that you have a lot of symbols that you use in your processes. Those symbols are tools. They help you focus your intent on what you want to accomplish. And it's that focused intent that is the active ingredient that actually does things. Well, that's the same with the with the energy bodies and the and the light beams and all the rest of it. Those are tools that we use. Now, that doesn't mean that we should kind of blow them off. Oh, they're just tools. They're not real. We need those tools. We have a hard time focusing our intent if we don't use tools, because we have all these beliefs about things like, you can't affect anything if you don't do something. So we have to do something. We have to apply a symbol or apply a tool. And that's I'm going over something that's kind of a deep and difficult thing for a lot of people to understand, and I got a breezing over it here at 100 miles an hour, so forgive me.
It's good, though. It's good.
Too much sense. That's the way it is. So you talk about chakras. Well, chakras are just another way of organizing the data. It's not that the data is wrong. It's just that that's one way of interpreting the data, of organizing the data. Okay?
And so when people, for example, when I do Reiki, I feel physical heat, and so do the clients that I'm working on. So how would you describe that physical manifestation of heat?
Well, that physical manifestation of heat is something that you do feel, and I would suspect that if you actually put a thermometer against you, it would indicate heat. My guess is that heat is a physical thing, not just an interpretation of heat, if you will. And I would also guess that it's a high probability that would be true of your patients, too. But what's going on there is that you are affecting something in their system. And one of the ways that we kind of one of the metaphors we use, one of the things we think of is that when we're affecting something, it'll get warm. That's just kind of a natural way of looking at things. Just like, white light is a natural way to approach transferring energy. So if you have intent that you want to transfer energy to something, then, a light beam is a good way to do it. Well, heat's a good way to show effectiveness that you're doing something, and it's the intent that creates the heat. So it's not that the heat isn't real. It's that the heat is an artifact of your intent. It's a sign. It's a symbol of what it is you're doing. It gives you feedback that you're being effective. So the heat's real. But the reason for it, or what's creating the heat, is your mind, because it's all consciousness. Remember, that physical body that you're heating up is just data. It's just data.
So then consciousness with intent, conscious intent, creates matter, would you say?
Yes, conscious intent can modify this reality frame. Absolutely. Conscious intent is the motivator, because all of this reality is just consciousness. It's just data, and we're consciousness. We're getting this data fed to our consciousness, and through our conscious intent, we can modify that data. We can change the way things happen. We can heal. We can make statistical distribution skew to one side or the other, like atomic decaying, and there's a lot of experiments done like that. And we can affect this reality frame with our intent. And that's because this reality frame is consciousness, so, consciousness affects consciousness.
Now, there's some sayings in indigenous cultures that the healers, the shamans, were able to astral travel out into the cosmos with their consciousness. What's been your experience? Have you done any research in that area? What's been your experience with that?
Well, that's certainly something that, anybody can learn to do. That's just, that's like the out of body. Out of body is really just focusing your awareness in another reality frame outside of this reality frame. So if you're no longer in this reality frame, which is the physical matter frame, then you're, non-physical. And that's what they call about being out of body, is really out of this physical frame. So certainly you can take your awareness and you can place it anywhere you want. You can move it around inside of this universe, inside this reality frame. You can go, sit on the backside of the moon or see what's on, such and such a star, or you can get outside of this frame altogether and wander around and explore realities that have nothing to do with this universe. Sure, all of that is not only possible, but it's just the natural right of an aware consciousness.
Now, for people who think that perhaps that those kinds of conscious, meditations or intentions would be just your imagination, what would be your argument with that? How would you tell? Because I've been told that a lot, that people honestly think, how do you know it's not just my imagination? How do you know that I'm really there? We were talking about the heat coming out of the hands and how our intent creates manifestation. So if that is true, are we really manifesting in other dimensions when we do those kinds of traveling, or are we really there? Or is it just our imagination? Or is there even a difference between the two?
Well, yes, there is a difference, and it's a very good question. And, I always tell people you need to be skeptical, and you should not believe, anything that you have not experienced and know to be true. That will help you much better than looking for the correct belief. That's a much better philosophy. So skepticism is very good, and you should wonder that. It's a very good question. And, of course, I had that question in my own mind while I was out working with Bob. Is this real, or is this just something I'm making up? And I think everybody, as they begin to meditate and begin to explore, must have those same questions. They should have those same questions. Now, the way you answer that is that you need to do things that are evidential, things that you can check. Now, if you're out looking at some star system someplace, there's no way to check that because there is no data that you can check that against. But there is lots and lots of things that you can do that are evidential. They're things that have to do with this physical frame, such as healing. Now, of course, if you make an attempt to heal somebody and they get better, that doesn't necessarily mean you're having an effect, because they may have gotten better anyway. You never know, what might have happened if you hadn't tried healing. They may have gotten better all by themselves. But you use statistics in this case, and that's how you have to gather your evidence. So you can't heal one person and decide you're a healer. You have to heal, 1,000 people. And then you look at the statistics. How many of them got better, right after your work? You got better in just the way that you had worked on them. And if that's like, well, about half of them did and half of them didn't, then you're probably not doing much. It's probably just random chance. If, on the other hand, 98% of them got better, right after you worked, and the ones that you didn't work on, most of those just continued as they were, then you have to realize that you're doing something. So it's a statistical analysis of those things that you can measure. You can do out-of-bodies, and you can, remote view. And then you have to go check and see if what you saw was actually there. And when it is, you look and say, well, how did I feel? What did I do? What was that process like? And then you work for the things that work for you, and you let go of the things that don't work, and eventually you get good at it. So, yes, you do have to differentiate between something you're just making up inside your head and something that's going on outside of you. And the only way to do it is with experience, practice, and a lot of experience and practice, and kind of keep the statistics of how it works. And, science does the same thing. For instance, if a pharmaceutical makes a pill that takes away headaches, let's say, and if they give somebody that pill and their headache goes away, that doesn't mean anything. That won't allow them to market that pill because that headache may have gone away anyway. The only way they can prove that their pill works is to give that pill to 1,000 people with headaches and, have a large number of that 1,000 have their headache go away. Then they can say, we've proven that, this pill helps headaches go away. Well, they have. It's a statistical proof. You have to prove what you're doing is real in the same way. There's no quick way to do it. You just have to do the work.
So would you say then that perhaps people need to check in with their intentions then, be more aware of their intentions? In Reiki, we teach that it's not us doing the healing, it's a higher power doing the healing, and so our intentions have to kind of be plugged in, if you will, to, stepping out of our own way so that the energy can come through. And the intentions have to be very, very clear and very solid. And if you're having an off day, or if you're stressed, or if your own body is worn out, then the session may not be as effective. So I'm wondering then if people would need to focus then on practicing understanding or being conscious of what their intentions are, or even what that means. What would you say?
Absolutely. You're right there. When I say that intent, conscious intent, moves consciousness. That's the motive force within reality. You can't do that if your intent is noisy, if your intent is flying all over the place, if it's not solid. That's why we start with meditation. Meditation allows us to let go of the noise. So if we have a very kind of random, busy signal, our attention is here, and then it's someplace else, and then it comes back, well, that intent is very weak and does little at all. So it's exactly the way you say. You have to learn how to focus that intent clearly, strongly, and hold it that way. You can't be jumping around, and that's something that most people find very difficult to do. But that's a required step. Otherwise, you're not really focusing much energy or much power with that intent. The difference would be like if you have sun coming through a window and it feels warm on your back, but if you put a big magnifying glass that focuses that same energy, you can burn a hole through a piece of metal. Focused energy is a lot more powerful than unfocused energy, and yes, that is a skill that has to be learned.
Mm. So this just popped into my mind as I was listening to you talk. Would this explain then the 100th monkey syndrome, where one consciousness, so to speak, can change, and how we can kind of catch that, if you will, across the board? How does that theory fit into what we're talking about?
We're all consciousness. We're all those units of consciousness, and we're all netted. Okay, every consciousness can communicate with every other. And, the 100th monkey syndrome basically has to do with, consciousness communicating, to other consciousness. So we're all on this net. We all, you've heard the phrase, we're all one. Well, that's true. We're all netted. We all communicate with each other all the time in non-physical ways. When you meet somebody and you really like them and you say, gee, I got really good vibes from that person. Vibes is kind of a new agey word, but basically what that means is that your non-physical communications were very positive. And, of course, sometimes they're negative. Sometimes you just don't like people for no particular reason, and that's the same reason. Mm. So, yes, there is such, we're all netted. So when we're netted, and let's say we have a whole group of us together, we tend to feed each other's consciousness. So if that's negative, then we call it a mob. A bunch of people who feed each other's consciousness doing something nasty becomes a mob, a lynch mob, for instance. But a bunch of people doing things that are loving and caring and whatever, they tend to generate that loving and caring feeling among that consciousness. So there is consciousness among, groups of people that, affect the attitudes and the actions and the beliefs and the intents of that group. So the 100th monkey, is just an artifact of consciousness. That's just the way consciousness works.
So one person really can change the world then?
One person can do a lot. One person can influence a lot of people. And look at the people who have been able to do that. A couple of names come to mind right away. Mahatma Gandhi would be one. Look at what he did. He drove the British Empire out of Britain, and he was just one little skinny guy. It wasn't because he was, so mighty and he could, apply force and force the British out. That's not what it was at all. It was the power that came from his quality of consciousness. That's what was so powerful. Look at Martin Luther King, a man who did, tremendous good. And he was powerful because of the quality of his consciousness. That's where power to affect things comes from. Yes, single people can affect a lot, but I would suggest that if people want to help fix this world, they start by fixing themselves. Mm. Once they are fixed themselves, then what they are will radiate out to whoever can use it.
because I was thinking as you were talking, there's one person out there listening saying, well, Martin Luther King is great and so is Gandhi, but I'm no Martin Luther King and I'm no Gandhi, so why bother? And I think it's a really important point to mention that every single person listening right now has the potential to be an incredible influence of love and positivity in our planet, in our world. And it really does start with ourselves and looking within and getting our intent and figuring out how to strengthen that. What do you mean by, we're going to move on a little bit to absolute unbounded oneness. I love that term.
Well, when I was writing the books, I come from a long series of encounters with the federal bureaucracy. I've been a scientist both in the government and industry serving the government. So acronyms come pretty natural to me. And I needed to name things because if you don't name things, then they're hard to talk about. So you tend to name things so that you can then discuss them. And I needed to come up with some names that talked about consciousness as it evolved. And I started with AUO, I guess. That was the unbounded oneness, and that was consciousness before it actually became as, shall we say, as intelligent or as focused. It was like the primordial consciousness, if you will, before it evolved. And then after it evolved, I picked the name Aum, which was absolute unbounded manifold. So these are just names I made up, and of course, Aum was made with a little tongue-in-cheek because Aum, is part of a meditation sound in the Eastern, particularly Tibetan culture. So that's all they are. They're just names for consciousness system, so we can talk about it at various states of its evolution.
So you're saying in the beginning it was a primordial form. Do you think that we have? Do you think that we have a memory of those states of being? If we are consciousness, and that's what we are, and that is the reality of things, does that explain then memories of past lives? Do you believe in past lives?
Oh yes. I mean, the way the consciousness system works is that the reason that we are here, the reason that this physical reality exists, is because it's a learning lab. It's a place where consciousness comes to experience. It's a virtual reality consciousness trainer, if you will. So consciousness comes here, gets into this reality frame, gets the data stream sent to them, so they're participating in this multiplayer game. And the whole point of having the game and the people in it is to grow up, is to reduce your entropy, to raise the quality of your consciousness, or the same thing would say would be to grow spiritually. So that's the point of being here. So, that's what we're doing, and that's why we're here, and that is our goal. And you can't do that with just one shot. It's a more complicated and takes a lot longer to grow up. As we're talking about, just, people have a tremendous problem just with their focus, just with their attention, just with their ability to have a steady, solid intent. It takes a lot of time to let go of fear and to let go of ego. So you have units of consciousness like us. We come here, we, experience, we grow, hopefully, and eventually, we need to let go of all of that, because what happens if you didn't have people cycling through in reincarnational cycles, you'd just be here with one long time, but people tend to get stuck. They tend to get into beliefs. They tend to get into, box themselves into corners, and there they would be. So the system is more efficient than that. It gives you a certain amount of time, a lifespan here, to work on the problems, and then you get to take whatever you've learned with you. You do get to take it with you and come back and work at it again. But when you come back and work at it again, you get to let go all of those blocks and things that kind of had you boxed in a corner. You get to start over and work on it again. And it takes many, many, many of those cycles before most of us begin to actually figure out what we're doing here.
So do you think that's why we forget from one incarnation to another?
Well, the reason we forget is because that's the only thing that's functional. Now, what good would it be if you could, right at this minute, had all the emotional feelings for the last, 3,000 husbands, children, wives, and, everybody else that was dear to your heart and that you had a great love for, you'd be a very confused person if you had to carry all that around with you all the time. And if you got into some kind of belief system and decided that, the thing that you should do is kill people that didn't believe it, the same way you did, and you were one of these people that gets into that, then it would be really handy if you could just let all that go and kind of start over. So, yes, we have to forget, because we need to we don't lose what we learned as far as our consciousness quality, but we have to start over again as far as our expressing that consciousness quality in this physical reality trainer.
And where do emotions and intuition fit into this?
Well, intuition is just you being aware of the data that's in your consciousness. You have those people who have a really good intuition are people who have their, I said we were all interacting all the time. We're all communicating non-physically with each other all the time, and with our higher selves as well. And there's communication going up and down this chain. And if you're aware of that communication, you call that your intuition. You get information, and it's paranormal in the sense that there's no normal way that you get that information. It just pops into your head that, Uncle Frank, finally died, or that your child is hurt someplace, and this stuff just comes to you, and it's your intuition. Well, that's just the data. Some people don't practice and don't take it seriously enough to develop those skills, and then they don't have much intuition. So that's something that everybody can, like you say, everybody can do these things. It's not the gifted few. This is just something that you can develop as you develop your own quality of consciousness.
So psychics, when they read energy from people or if somebody, they're tapping into data, you would say, correct?
Yes, they're tapping into data. There's databases out there. There's 3 major databases. One of them is the probable future database, and that's all of everything that possibly could happen and a probability assigned to it as far as its likelihood, an expectation value, its likelihood of happening. That's the probable future database. Now, the future is not a done deal. You have free will, and that when we make our choices in the present, then we just select, one of those possible things we could have done. We select one and we do it. That's how we grow. We make choices. But that's the probable, and that database is available, and you can get into that database and, look around in it. And also, then after the things that we do become our history thread. That's a database of all the things that we did. And then all the things we could have done but didn't do, that's another history database that is not actualized. It's a non-actualized history. All of those databases are available for consciousness to peruse. So you can, if you're one of these people that does psychometrics where you pick up an old relic or something, and then you can see how it was used and the people around it, and you can kind of you're just going into the database associated with that particular object, and you're picking up information. When you remote view, you're getting data out of that database. When you heal and bring up somebody's health aura, you're getting data out of that database. The database is queried with intent, and you get to tell it how you want the data, the formats that you want back. You can get graphs if you want. If you're looking for specific data and you'd like to see a graph of it, the database will give you a graph if you have a steady intent that can produce that. So yes, it's all just data, and you can get in there. If you get into those databases with your consciousness, it's just like being there. It's like being in a movie, if you will. You can either be an observer and watch it play out, or you can get right in there and modify it. So you can go and say our history database and say, well, what if I didn't do this? What if I hadn't done these other things? Or what if a thing I give in my books, what if Adolf Hitler had won World War II, and then conquered the whole planet? What if that happened? What would happen? And then you can follow along. All the probabilities are there, and you can follow along what the probabilities are that would happen next. Now, that doesn't mean that actually would necessarily have happened next. These are just the probabilities. But you can do that in all 3 of those databases. follow the
So
probability.
is that how people would, go into different dimensions or follow perhaps, the quantum physics and all of that stuff where these realities are happening just in different dimensions? Is it like tapping into those different probabilities or different dimensions to kind of feel out the storyline, if you will?
Well, I use the word reality frame rather than dimensions. I think that's what people mean. They go into a different reality frame or they go into one of these databases, but when they use the word dimension, basically what they're saying is it's not here. It's another dimension. That just means it's outside of the physical reality frame. And that's kind of a common word. But yes, they, people who, we have lots of people prognosticating, earthquakes and tidal waves and all that sort of stuff, and you can get that sort of information out of databases. You just have to know how to query it.
I call it energy. We have different terminology, but it's really interesting to hear you put it into a scientific realm. When I go to sacred sites around the world, I take groups to different places, and I leave from Mexico tomorrow to do a site visit, and it's really tangible when people ask me why I go to these places, and I can feel the history. I call it energy because I'm an intuitive, and that's how I work, but it's data that you're accessing or I'm accessing. People can feel the imprints of energy or the imprints of data that have been left there. That would explain paranormal activity then in your terms, correct?
Well, sure. Yeah, what you're doing is you're going to that place because you have the ability to control your intent and control it in a kind of powerful and steady way. You can tap into the databases of the things that happened there, the kind of feelings that were there. All of that's part of the historical record. And when you tap into that, you experience it. And you can experience it in as much detail or generally, vaguely, however you focus on it, you experience that, you have that experience. And you call it energy because energy is a term we use to say that it's something that does something. Energy affects something. Energy transmits information. Energy moves, energy informs. So that's just a good word to use. Well, it's energy. I'm picking up on the energy that's in that area. I'm picking up on the energy that happened there. But you can not go there. You can stay right where you are, go there with your mind and pick up on that same energy. That same data is available there. It's just that when you're physically in that place, you can then intend to feel, see, hear, and experience what happened in that place, whereas you could sit in your living room and intend, feel the things that happened in that place too. And if your intent was as steady both places, you'd get the same information both places. But most of us need these tools that help us focus. And when you're in a place, it's real easy because then it's just, you kind of let yourself feel what's happened there, what's been there, and you become a part of it. You become integrated with it. That's the energy that you're talking about, but just data, and you interpret it as energy. It's a matter of just integrating into that experience. That's very powerful.
It is. It's a powerful experience. I've seen many people get very emotional when they travel to to different places. They bring back. Some people feel past life memories come right to the surface. It's pretty incredible when those sort of things happen. Now, Tom, we're running out of time, and you have a couple appearances coming up. You have one in London, October 10th and 11th, correct?
That's right. I do.
And you also, for anybody listening who would like to find out more information about Tom's events and his workshops, can go to mbtevents.com. He will be in Campbell, California, February 20th and 21st, Costa Mesa, California, February 27th and 28th, and New York City, May 1st and 2nd. And I'll be joining you in London, actually. We'll be doing the Path premiere in London on October 9th, and I do believe that's sold out. So I'm looking forward to listening to you firsthand all weekend. So this was kind of a precursor to that.
Coming to the workshop as well, are you?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I'll be there.
Oh, good. That'll be fun.
Yeah. And so mybigtoe.com, and if you're interested in his trilogy book, you can find out how to purchase it there. And in closing, what is your message for humanity? I always ask my guests to kind of sum it up in 30 seconds or less. What are you hoping for the planet at this time?
Well, I would take that and focus it back down to the individual, because it's at the individual level is where the real traction is. That's what's important. And I would say my message would be to anybody listening out here is that the first thing that you need to do is improve the quality of your consciousness wherever you are. However much quality you have at this present time, what you need to do is improve the quality of your consciousness. Let go of fear, let go of ego, become love. And if you can do this, you will change not only yourself, but those around you. And those around you will change those around them. And this is how that process works and spreads and makes a difference greater than yourself. So start, though, with yourself, because that, at the bottom level, is where all the action has to start. It's with individual people.
Thanks so much for joining me, Tom. It's been a pleasure. We're like pebbles in a pond, guys. Our consciousness ripples out to the shore, and we affect everything within our space, within our planet, and within our universe. I'm Hillary Raimo. Until next time, namaste.